Influence is one of those things we'd all like to have more of. But did you realize that you already have more influence than you think? If you don't believe me, you will before the end of this episode. Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Are you ready? Let's go.
Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We are here each week to help you lead more confidently and make a bigger difference, both professionally and personally. This episode is brought to you by Remarkable Masterclasses. Remarkable Masterclasses are short, high-quality video training modules covering a wide range of topics. Each one is designed to help leaders build the skills they need to succeed. Learn more at remarkablepodcast.com/master. And now, here's your host, Kevin.
Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, everybody. We're talking about one of my favorite topics today, because as a leader, we are in the influence business. We all want it, and maybe, just maybe, you're going to learn today that you have more of it already than you might think. Let me explain that to you after I introduce my guest. Our guest today is Vanessa Bohns. She is a social psychologist and professor of organizational behavior at Cornell University and holds a PhD in psychology from Columbia and an AB from Brown. She is the author of the brand new book, You Have More Influence Than You Think: How We Underestimate Our Power of Persuasion and Why It Matters. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Harvard Business Review, and her research has been featured in Wall Street Journal, New York Times, NPR's Hidden Brain. She's everywhere. And today she's on the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Vanessa, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so glad to have you. I'm saying it's a new book. I'm just going to give everybody a bit of a timestamp here. You and I are talking in July. No one else is going to hear this till December. And of course, we don't know when other people will hear it. But we'll still call it a new book because it's going to be a book that has legs and is going to last a long time. I'm predicting that now, even though I'm only reading what's called an advanced reading copy. Vanessa, you didn't wake up when you were 8 and say, I want to be a social psychologist. I'm guessing. So tell us a little bit about the journey that leads you to what you're doing and writing this book and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I didn't wake up when I was 8 and say that, but I got pretty close. I was at my mother's house recently, and we were looking through things that I had from second grade, and I do have this little binder full of all this documented research on the chickens that I had in my backyard. And so I was already kind of doing research, which is kind of funny. And it's kind of ironic how similar it is to the way I document people now. I looked at those files.
So what kind of behavior were you documenting in the chickens?
Oh, their kind of interactions with humans, with me. I mean, I had some struggles with them chasing me from time to time, and their interactions with one another and, 8-year-old type things though. But
I love it.
Yeah.
I love that. So are we talking farm here? Or are we just talking a few chickens at the house?
So I sort of a farm. Yeah, we had my father raised pheasants and had a bird farm for a number of years. And so we had peacocks and geese and whatnot. So I always was kind of interested in behavioral research to some extent. And then, I was always interested in psychology. So as an undergrad, I was a psychology major. After that, I went into advertising, which is very sort of psychology adjacent. Yeah. And I left it because I wanted to do market research, but it was in the accounting department or in the accounts department. And so I wasn't really doing that kind of research that I was really interested in. And then I worked in a sleep lab, which is obviously very psychology based. I stopped doing that because it was making me tired all the time to be up all night. And then
I want to sleep. Awesome. Well, so it sounds like all roads led you to where you are, which is a good sign.
Kind of did, yeah.
Having asked that question of now, I don't know, your episode number 298. So having asked that question of lots of people, pretty much everybody, I think it's interesting that some people have sort of early markers that led them in a direction more like yours, and others like, they start by saying, well, I don't know. very eclectic kind of thing. And I think it's I love asking the question because I think it's useful for people to learn, because all of you that are listening, you're at all different ages, and it's sort of never too late. And I always find that question sort of very inspiring regardless of people's answers. So thank you for sharing that, Vanessa. So you wrote this book, How to Have More Influence. You have more influence than you think, which in some ways is the big idea of the book. But sort of, I was going to ask you what is the big idea of the book, but I think the title sort of says that. But what is the big idea, or what sort of led you to writing the book? Maybe that's a better question.
Yeah, well, the slip of calling it How to Have More Influence Than You Think is actually exactly what it is that led me to write this book, because there are so many books about that, right? So many books about how to gain influence and get to yes and win friends and influence people. And those books are great. Don't get me wrong. I read them, I eat them up. They have great tips. But as a social psychologist who studied social influence for about a decade and a half now, I see all the time how much influence we already have without really trying, without needing sort of tricks and tips and things like that. And so I kind of wanted to put that message out there as well, because the popularity of that message, that you kind of need all the support to gain influence, you need to read all these books and take all these seminars, just doesn't sort of fit with what I see in the research. And so the book really reviews research that has people test their impressions of how much influence they have against some objective reality. And they find out that they have more than they actually think. And
so people just heard you say lots of research. I got to tell everybody, this is one of those books, and I could put this in with, and I'm going to put this in with a Malcolm Gladwell type of book and a Chip and Dan Heath type of book. Yes, I'm mentioning you with those people, Vanessa, because it's the kind of book that, yes, there's research here, and yes, she's a PhD, and this is a book that tells stories that helps take that research and make it relevant. And so I don't want anyone to say, oh, I don't want to read that because it's just researchy. It's researchy without being heavy. Is that hopefully you hear that as the compliment that's meant to be, Vanessa?
That's a huge compliment. Yeah, I mean, it definitely. So it's packed with research, but it's packed with stories as well. And I'll say that the research that it is packed with, I think, is particularly fun. It's not like people just come into the lab and fill out some surveys. It's people come into the lab, they make a guess about how other people are going to respond to them, or they talk to someone and they make a guess, like, what did that person think of me? Then we're able to tell them, that we track how people actually respond to them, or we ask the other person that they just interacted with how they felt about that person. So it's kind of research into the kinds of things that we would all like in our day-to-day experience. Like after I talk to this person and I walk away and I'm like, oh my God, did I talk too long? Did I say something stupid? I just want someone else to run over to give that person a survey and ask those questions of that person. And so that's the kind of research that I talk about in the book. Like, what would happen if you walked away from this interaction and someone surveyed that person about you and how that interaction just went?
All right, so I'm going to give everybody an example. Because all of us have been here. All of us have gone into a meeting or gone into a party or gone into a group, and we've got a stain on our shirt, or we've got mismatched socks. Specifically, the research is about, something on our shirt, and we've all gone in and we're so self-conscious about our shirt, and everyone's going to see the stain on our shirt. So what can we learn about influence from the stain on our shirt, Vanessa?
Yeah, this is interesting. So this is a classic study you're referring to that looks at something called the spotlight effect. And it's basically this effect that shows that when there's something we're super self-conscious about, when we have a stain on our shirt, when we have mismatched shoes or whatever it is, we think everybody else is looking at that embarrassing thing, right? And so in these studies, the researchers, who are actually some researchers here at Cornell, Tom Gilovich and his co-authors, they asked people basically, how much did you notice this embarrassing thing on this person's shirt? In this case, they had participants wear a Barry Manilow t-shirt, thinking that was something people were going to be very self-conscious to walk around wearing. And people thought that basically everyone was going to be noticing the shirt, but really most people didn't notice, right? And didn't actually think that they were wearing anything embarrassing. And so one of the sort of takeaways from that is that we think that we're kind of blundering through interactions with other people, or that people are kind of viewing us in this negative light, when in fact people actually are not seeing the sort of things that we're insecure about that we think that they are.
That is such good news. Not as many people saw. And then, of course, there's because where my head went as I was reading that was, and so I've been obsessing about that, which has changed the way I interacted with people, which probably then potentially had a negative impact on how much influence I might have had beyond it, because I'm looking down at my shirt, right? So it's really, really good stuff, right? So you have a whole chapter in the book about saying no. And in fact, I believe the chapter is actually titled why saying no. Yeah. Why it's so hard to say no. So why is it, Vanessa, so hard to say no?
Yeah. In particular, it's really hard to say no, I'd say, to someone who's asking you for something right in front of you, face to face. And part of the reason is that, saying no to someone is really, we call it face threatening, right? It suggests that there's something wrong with what they're asking, or something about our relationship that we don't want to help them out. And so we don't want to imply that. So my colleague here, another colleague of mine here at Cornell, calls this insinuation anxiety, that we don't want to insinuate something bad about another person, right? So if someone comes up to you, and this is one of the studies that I do, someone comes up to you and asks to borrow your phone, right? And you might not want to give it to them in the moment. You might not know this person. You might not trust them. But do you really want to convey to them that you don't trust them, right? Yeah, you're like insinuating something negative about that other person, right? You're suggesting, right, that person shouldn't be asking for this, or you don't trust them to give it back. And so because we really don't want to sort of hurt the relationship with other people around us, because we really rely on other people for all sorts of things, we don't want to offend them. And so it's really hard to say no when someone asks us for something. And so in the studies that I've run, people think, like, if I go up and ask people for their phones, for example, that most people will say no. But in fact, what we find is many more people say yes to that than we tend to think. And that's where the influence comes from, that, just in a simple ask, you have so much more influence than you think.
Yeah. So one of my mentors always said, Kevin, you have to ASK to GET. If you don't ask, you can't get. So I think that's absolutely right. So is there any difference there about that specifically? Well, we could ask this about any of the stuff we talk about today, but I specifically want on that point about, asking, the simple request kind of thing. Are there cultural differences here?
That's a great question. Yeah. So we've actually run our asking studies where we have people go out and ask strangers for favors in China. And we've run them in all sorts of other places. We've run them in the Netherlands. We've run them in Canada. We've run them, in all sorts of different areas of the U.S. But particularly kind of looking at China versus the U.S. and this collectivistic versus this individualistic kind of culture, we do find we get the same effect. So basically, in both places, people think people are going to be more likely to say no to them than they actually are. And so that's kind of good news. People are more helpful than we think all over the place. But the effect is smaller in our Chinese sample. And the way we explain that is basically that people in collectivistic cultures are kind of aware of the obligation we all have to do things for other people if we're asked. And so there's kind of a heightened awareness that that's a thing. In the US, we tend to think, because we're this individualistic culture, we think that people do things because they want to, right? It's the rebel, like at the end of the movie, who's going to stand up and do their thing. We assume that people don't do things out of obligation, but in fact, that's a universal characteristic. We all do things out of obligation. We all find it hard to say no. We just kind of don't recognize that as much as in more individualistic cultures.
So are you saying then that the gap between the guess and the reality is smaller in China, or is
Exactly.
the overall number of yeses lower?
So the overall number of yeses is actually higher, and the gap is smaller. So more people say yes, because it is true that in a collectivistic culture, there is a little bit more of an obligation, right, to do things for other people. But the gap is also smaller because not only is there more of an obligation, there's more of an awareness of that.
An awareness and an expectation of that obligation.
Exactly.
Right? That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So we're here, this is the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. And so people that are here are in a leadership role, planning to be, aspiring to be in a leadership role. But, I think we can pretty much guess that most all of you that are watching or listening are in a leadership role of some sort. And so I think we ought to talk, and I'm sure you're all wanting me to ask Vanessa about the role of power, or in this case, positional power on persuasion and influence. So talk about that in general in terms of the research and your research about that role, because a lot of people, and then I want to talk about it, in a couple of different ways, but just in general, what role does power play in persuasion and influence?
Yeah, this is such an important question, because it's really easy to sort of think that, people in positions of power wouldn't exhibit the same kind of bias, right? Because they're in power. Of course, they know they have power. They know that they have influence over people. But in fact, the research suggests that people in positions of power display this bias even more, right? And so if you think about why that might be the case, so one of my colleagues, Adam Glinsky at Columbia University, he says, when you're in a position of power, your whisper sounds like a shout, right? So to other people, you ask for something gently, but it really sounds like an order, right? So you have that much more power. It's harder for people to say no to you. But the interesting thing about power is that there's a psychological effect as well that makes us less able to see that, to make us, so for example, as much as it gets harder for people to say no to you when you're in a position of power, you think it's actually easier, because when you're in a position of power, first of all, research shows that you get worse at taking other people's perspectives, which is just kind of because you don't need to. So it's not necessarily,
or you think you don't need to. Let's just be clear, right?
Exactly.
That becomes a bias problem, but go ahead.
Yes, that's absolutely true. So, but there is this sort of psychological effect that has been shown. For example, in Adam Glinsky's studies of this, he primes people with power. So he puts them in sort of an immediate feeling of having power by having them remember a time they had power. And then he has them write the letter E on their forehead, a capital E. And you can write it so that other people can see it and read it, or you can write it pointed so that no one would be able to see it. And what he finds is that when people are primed with a position of high power, they aren't thinking of how other people might read something, right? They're not sort of automatically structuring something and taking someone else's perspective. So as much as it's harder for people to say no to you when you're in a position of power, you're also not sort of attending to that as much, that dynamic. And people in positions of power it's easier for them to say no to things because they have that power, right? And we tend to generalize to other people. So when we feel like, just say no if you don't want to do something, we assume other people can do the same. So when you're in a position of power, basically you can throw things out there, you can ask for things you're not, sure if you should be asking for, and you can just assume people will just say no, right? And we can think of all sorts of contexts this can apply to, and Me Too and unethical requests and overwork on the weekends and things like that. But you just assume people say no if they don't want to go along with what I'm asking.
There's lots of reasons why that creeps in, right? Because sometimes we've been promoted to leadership roles because we were a little bit more proactive and we were perhaps a little bit more assertive in that regard. So we felt like we could. So we assume everyone else will, but the reality is not necessarily, right? So beyond what you've already said, Vanessa, do you have any specific advice for leaders around using their influence more effectively, judiciously, et cetera?
Yeah, for sure. And so this is, I skirted around in the book using the Spider-Man quote, right? That with great power comes great responsibility.
But now you've used it. The cat is out of the box now.
That's right. I'll just use it outside of the book. But that's kind of the gist of what people in positions of power and in leadership need to do. And so one of the things I talk about in the book is people who are really effective leaders who really recognize that leadership position comes with a lot of responsibility. right? And so there is research showing that actually, if you remind people of how much responsibility comes with leadership, they don't actually want to be leaders as much, right? Because it's not, we don't just naturally think of that. We think more about the opportunities, and we're moving up in the world, and we're going to, take our group here, and we're going to do all these great things. And we don't think, I am actually responsible for this group of people now. And so the more that we can do that and kind of frame leadership as responsibility, the better. And so some examples I give in the book, like simple things, like for example, when the leader speaks first, right? No one wants to go against what they said. And people who recognize the responsibility of this leadership power position will let other people speak first, and then, give their opinion at the very end. So there's little things like that where you're just kind of aware that my presence here, the words I say, actually land a lot stronger than I might realize.
Vanessa, two things. First of all, the webinar that I was delivering just before we got together has a slide that talks about leadership responsibility. So I give myself an A for that. And the second thing is that one of the things I say to people, leaders all the time, is you must talk less and you must talk later. You must talk less. And it's for that very point that you just made so eloquently. So now there's another point, though, because, we do get power all bundled up with influence and persuasion. And we've talked about how to unhook that a little bit for us as leaders, or to understand that better. But as a team member, and all of you who are listening as leaders, you're also a team member, right? You're on the team that you lead, but you're also on other teams, right? And you have a boss too. So talk about influence when you don't have the position, and like at work, when you don't have the positional power, sort of as a team member, a teammate. Maybe when I want to influence my boss, right? The opposite of that power, the opposite side of that power differential. What is your advice to us in that spot?
Yeah, it's really interesting. The research also shows what in these cases, which we tend to call upward influence, right? Where you're influencing people above you, that we also tend to underestimate our influence in those kinds of contexts. And so one recent set of studies that came out, which I found fascinating, was people would guess how much older people would take their advice. And when we're younger, we kind of think, I can't give advice to older people. They're not going to listen to me. There's this kind of generational divide that, like, if you're older, you're the one giving advice. But in fact, older people are more willing to take younger people's advice than we tend to think when we're in that sort of younger position, when we're influencing upwards. And so one thing would be to not underestimate the influence that you have over people above you. Like, they really are listening, maybe more than you think, and taking to heart the things that you're suggesting. And then there's a section in the book that I call The Power of Being in the Audience. And I basically talk about just showing up to meetings, because what happens is when someone's giving a presentation, we think that they're the one at the front of the room, they're sort of commanding the room, and they're focusing on what they want to say to us. But in fact, when you're standing up there, right, you're looking at how everybody else is reacting. You're seeing the faces in the room. You want to make them happy. You want to make them agree with you. And so you kind of frame your message in a way that appeals to them. So just by being there, people are noticing you, even if you don't have a lot to say. They're kind of paying attention to you. They're framing their message for you, and sort of just taking into account sort of what you might be thinking. And so just showing up can have a big impact on how people think about a problem.
I absolutely loved that stuff. There's actually something else. I didn't have this in my thinking, but I want to share that quickly. One of the things that I loved is the research about how if I eat a piece of chocolate and taste it, and then I say how much I like it or I didn't like it, or if I'm eating it and I know someone else is eating from the same chocolate, that I like it more. Or if I really hate it, I hate it more. Either way. And it immediately made me think about, I'll let you say any more about that if I messed up the study, but it made me immediately think of, well, that's why it's so smart that wineries have tasting rooms, right? Because if I'm drinking it with you, I like it more. And so, man, I'm more likely to buy it. I just found that, like, ta-da! That just showed up for me as I read that.
Yeah, those studies are fascinating. They're done by Erica Boothby, who is a wonderful researcher I've worked with. And she calls it the amplification of shared experiences. So basically, if we're, eating dessert together at a restaurant, or, tasting wine, or appreciating art at a museum, we're not only appreciating it ourselves and tasting it ourselves, we're doing something she calls mentalizing. And that is trying to imagine what that other person is thinking of it, right? We always want to know, like, how do you like the dessert? What do you think of this art? What do you think of the wine? So we're kind of doubling up on the experience by trying to figure out how somebody else is reacting to it as well. And so when we share an experience with someone, when someone's there with us, it actually amplifies that experience. If it's terrible, it makes it worse. That particular thing, it might make the experience better, but it makes like the wine
exactly right. Now we've got this shared experience of, man, that was the worst meal ever, or whatever. By the way, in the book, I'm not going to say any more about it, but there's even dating advice that Vanessa shares. It's part of it's related to that very point, but we will move on from there. So, okay, you've now told us that, okay, you've got more influence than you think, right? How do we better understand, in our day-to-day life, in life situations, how can we better realize or be aware of this amount of influence?
Yeah, so I give a few suggestions in the book of sort of practical ways that we can be more mindful of the influence that we have in a given situation. And so one of them is that if you think about the way that we experience the world, right, we're always looking out through our own two eyes. We're always seeing everything else that's out in the world. And the thing that we don't see when we do that is ourselves, right? So we see how everybody else is contributing to a situation, but we don't see what we might be doing that might be, people might be reacting to, for example. And so one suggestion is to get out of your own head as much as you can. And so there's some research done on taking a third-party perspective. So basically, in a moment, try to step back mentally and think about what other people are seeing, how other people are seeing you, right? And how other people are seeing your behaviors. So that's one thing. Another thing is something that's called getting perspective, and that's in contrast to taking perspective. And if you've read How to Win Friends and Influence People, Dale Carnegie talks about taking people's perspective. But when you take perspective, you never get out of your own head. You just try to imagine what someone else might be feeling. So getting perspective is asking questions, basically asking to find out what someone else is actually feeling. And then the third thing I talk about is experiencing your influence. So testing it out. So a lot of my studies are people, asking for things and seeing what happens, and, giving someone positive feedback and finding out that actually that went really well. And so I put all those things together that we want to see, feel, and experience our influence sort of in this day-to-day way to be more mindful in different situations of our impact on other people.
There's 4 or 5 pages early in the book that I would really like. I have lots of leaders that I work with that say, that have trouble with, are concerned about giving positive feedback, right? They should already know they're doing their job. That's not, you've heard all that, and everyone who's listening has heard that too. There's 4 or 5 pages early in the book that really get at the research that says, man, when we share positive feedback with people, it makes a huge difference. Far more than we realize. And by the way, if we happen to be the boss, even more than that. So we talked about the responsibility of leadership. What's the responsibility of influence?
Yeah, I think it's pretty similar, except that, as we talked about, there's a difference between sort of being in the power position and being, at least assuming you're not in the power position, or sort of trying to lead people upwards, right, from a lower status sort of position. And part of what the book is talking about is that we have influence in all contexts, right? So not just when we're the leader, not just when we're in power, but also, with our colleagues who are at the same level of us. And, we have a responsibility to call things out when we see them, even if we see like bosses doing them, for example, and that our words actually have a bigger impact than we might think. And so one thing, I alluded to this earlier, but I'll circle back to that. But one area in which, this really kind of comes alive is like in the Me Too movement. right? So we talked about how hard it is to say no, and how people, if I ask someone for a favor, they're going to agree because it's hard to say no. And that's fine, because everyone walks away from that interaction and everyone feels good. You got a favor, the other person feels like a good person, and everyone's happy. But there are all sorts of other things that my research and other people's research shows are also hard to say no to. And one is if we ask coworkers out on dates at work, for example, and especially when you're the boss, right? Getting back to sort of leadership and power. But it's hard to say no as well to people's romantic advances, especially in the workplace where you have to see these people all the time. And as we talked about, you don't want to insinuate something negative, like, I don't like you, I don't want, there's something wrong with you asking. And so you feel like you have to say yes. And so I'd say there's also this responsibility of influence, that we're aware of the things we're asking for, we're aware of the context we're using our influence, and really whether it makes sense to be using it in that way. And so one of the things I talk about that makes this book quite different from a how to gain influence type of book is that in some cases, you actually should step back and use your influence less, right? And that's something you don't usually hear in how to gain influence. It's all about use it more, 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 more. But this is if you're going to be more mindful of the influence you already have. Sometimes you should use it more, and sometimes you actually need to be mindful enough to use it less.
And I'll add, or use it differently, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think is fair. I'm going to ask you another question before we sort of shift gears. And before I even ask, I'm guessing that it could be a whole conversation. So, I mean, I know that you're probably going to need to parse your thinking here a bit. Maybe it will be a whole other conversation. Who knows? What about influence at a distance? We're working remotely. We're going to work hybridly. We're not always going to be with our coworkers every day in the future. And many of us, most of us. What thoughts do you have about advice for us, perhaps, around influence at a distance?
Yeah, so we have some research on influence through technology versus in person. And we've looked, for example, at trying to influence people or ask for things over email, over phone, over Zoom or video technology, and we've compared it to face-to-face. There is some bad news for this transition, which is that nothing beats face-to-face. So pretty much in every single context, and we really didn't know what to expect when we looked at video context, because you've got face there, you're in real time. You would think that it can sort of recapture what it's like to be in person. But in fact, when we've had people ask other people for things over video, they're more likely to say no than if you're actually standing there in person face to face. And so there's some research that hints at why that might be the case, which we can then use to sort of increase our influence when we have to do it from a distance, right? So for example, one of the things we lack when we're not face-to-face with someone is a certain amount of social connection and trust, right? When someone's in your immediate physical space, you kind of have this default trust of that person. And so you have to kind of work extra hard to build that trust if you're sending someone an email, or to sort of increase that social connection over Zoom, maybe share a little bit more small talk before you actually try to influence someone. And the other thing is just how much attention we pay to people in person versus over, through technology. So
I might be checking my phone while I'm on the video with you guys. I'm less likely to do that face to face.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
There's definitely more we could talk about there, and maybe we will at some point. You and I can have that conversation later. But I want to shift and ask you, a couple of other questions before we finish. Kinds of the questions that I always ask. I want to shift us out of all of this work stuff. By the way, we've been talking with Vanessa Bohns, the author of this fabulous new book, You Have More Influence Than You Think, subtitled How We Underestimate Our Power of Persuasion and Why It Matters. Highly recommend this book to you all. But when you're not doing research, reading research, what do you do for fun, Vanessa?
So I'm up in Ithaca, which is gorgeous, as we all know, as many people know. And so I do enjoy hiking. It is pretty gorgeous to hike around here, around the gorges and the waterfalls, etc.
All right. Hiking is your thing. That's awesome. And so what are you knew I was going to ask this question because you did your homework, listened to other episodes. So what are you reading these days, Vanessa?
Yeah, so I just recently finished my friend Ethan Cross's book, Chatter, which has been getting some traction. It's just fascinating. It's all about the voice in our head and how we can sort of control it and change it from being a critic to a coach, sort of the punchline. And one thing that was fun about his book coming out, sort of close to the time my book is coming out, is that we went to grad school together, and Ethan is the person I did my very first experiment with as a graduate student. It failed. It never got published, but it's kind of fun that we had that experience together.
Chatter by
Now his book Chatter is out.
By Ethan Cross. And You Have More Influence Than You Think by Vanessa Bohns. Vanessa, where can we learn more about what you're doing? Where can we connect? People can connect with you. Let people know that.
Sure. So I have a website, vanessabohns.com, and Bohns is Bohns. I'm also on Twitter @Prof Bohns, and I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me there. And again, the book is all over the place, Amazon, anywhere you buy books.
Anywhere fine books are sold. So before I bid you farewell, Vanessa, and before we end this episode, I asked the question I ask every single episode. And that is, now what, everybody? You've been listening to us now for 35 minutes. What are you going to do? What action are you going to take as a result of this? Maybe you need to remember the quote that she shared, that when we're the leader, our whisper sounds like a shout. Maybe we need to think more about our responsibility as a leader. Maybe you need to think about how you can have more upward influence. Maybe you just need to realize, step back and listen to what Vanessa has told you about the reality that you have more influence than you think. Maybe you need to ask more often than you do. There's any number of things that it might be for you. I'm not meaning to presume it. I'm only giving you some examples of some of the things that we talked about. But I hope that you will ask yourself that question, because far more value will come from this investment of your time by taking action than simply by listening to the two of us. So, Vanessa, thank you so much for being here. It was absolutely a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great.
All right, everybody. So before we go, today's episode was brought to you by Remarkable Master Classes. You can learn more about our brand new process for delivering high quality, high importance learning via the masterclass format at remarkablemasterclass.com. You can go there to learn about a specific skill or about how you can get discounts by joining us more regularly, all at remarkablemasterclass.com. And as every week, we'll be back here with another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Thanks, everybody.